Hello and welcome to the World Affairs Council of Atlanta's virtual forum, Shifting Alliances in the Middle East and the Arab League. I'm Rickey Bevington, president of the council. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit membership forum for informed discussion of global affairs that impact Metro Atlanta. You can learn more about membership at our website, wacatlanta.org. Thank you for joining us today as we delve into the larger themes of this year's Arab League Summit, which starts tomorrow in Saudi Arabia. We have a broad and diverse audience online with us today, including former U.S. Ambassador to Kuwait, Lawrence Silverman. Thank you for being here. Today's guest expert is Dr. Rashid Naim. He's Principal Senior Lecturer in the Political Science Department of Georgia State University. His areas of research and teaching are international relations, religion and politics, Middle East politics, international relations of the Middle East, South Asian politics, and nuclear proliferation. And Dr. Naim founded the Model United Nations and the Model Arab League programs at Georgia State and has run them for the past 16 years. Welcome, Dr. Rashid Naim.
Thank you. Thank you, Rickey.
And I wanted to bring in an expert who not only is an academic expert in this field, but also you're a teacher and you can help teach us and break these complicated concepts down. You work with high school students, you work with university students to help them do the Model Arab League. So I thought you were the perfect person to invite today. So why don't you put on your teacher hat and talk about the genesis of the Arab League and bring us up to today, who's a part of it and what is their goal?
Okay, so the Arab League is actually the oldest regional organization in the world, and it comprises of about 22 countries right now, which is supposed to be the Arab world. The one important thing to remember is that, not unlike many other national-based organizations, Arab nationalism is not based on shared ethnicity; it is based on shared language. So that is why you find countries which are ethnically as diverse as the Comoro Islands and Morocco and Iraq, all members of the Arab League. And that is because Arabic is either the principal language or at least the second principal language in those countries. So that's the basis of the organization. So the organization was put together really as a response to the rise of Arab nationalism which starts really with the First World War and kind of matures in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And the idea was to have a forum where Arab countries could get together and work together for the common good of all its member states. That was the general broad idea. Though in reality, of course, there has never been agreement among all the different regimes in the Arab world as to what the League is actually supposed to be about. So that has been one of their big issues.
And we just have a map here that we wanted to just sort of orient people on the globe of member nations here. So if this is helpful to folks, just to see where we're at. And so I'm sorry, did we cut you off, Dr. Naim?
No, I'm here. I can see it.
Okay, great. Well, great. So I'll just let the audience take a look for a moment, and then we're going to get into what happened just over a decade ago, which is the context in which tomorrow's event is taking place. So take a look at the map. We're going to bring it back down now. Now that we're oriented, let me ask you about 2012, which was the turning point and sets the context in which we're talking today. What happened and why did a majority of member states, why were they willing to vote Syria out of the Arab League?
So the Arab League, the major turning point in 2012 was people referred to as the Arab Spring. I actually don't like that term. I call it the uprisings against the dictatorships, which is actually more accurate because it lasted a long time. It did lead to the change in regimes in several Arab countries. There were many other uprisings against what were perceived by their populations to be dictatorial governments which failed. Or were managed more effectively than, say, in Tunisia or Egypt or even Yemen. And so it was a turning point also in the sense that within the Arab world itself, there was the different regimes had very different positions on the different uprisings which were taking place. So, for example, the uprising against the Egyptian government did not get the support of the Gulf countries, as an example. But the uprising against the Syrian government got support from many of the Arab countries. In fact, the Syrians have routinely accused several of these countries of being actively involved in fomenting the ongoing civil war in Syria. Well, civil war is almost over. And not only that, it also, of course, drew in the Syrian civil conflict, drew in countries which were not part of the Arab League, but were in the neighborhood, Turkey and Iran in particular. So that really was a turning point in that sense. And now, since I think we can safely say that almost all the gains of those uprisings have been reversed with the imposition of what I think we can fairly call a dictatorship in Tunisia, back again to the old system almost, that there is, I think, a effort within the Arab countries of the need to reassess what they're going to do going forward and what relationships need to be mended, what mending those relationships would mean, and how do you go about doing that. And the vote to allow Syria back in is just one small step in this whole process of dealing with the schisms which happened in the region during this period of a series of uprisings. Not just the first wave, but then the second wave again, which was in places like Sudan and so on later on.
And the impact on the broader neighborhood is something we're going to be getting into. I want to just dwell on the Syrian civil war for a moment, because it just cannot be minimized. I'm going to quote the Economist this morning. It's strong words, but this is the Economist perspective, at least one reporter, the Economist perspective. The Arab League tends to be a club of ruthless dictators, but even by its own standards, Bashar al-Assad stands out. He plunged the country into civil war starting in 2011 to preserve his grip on power, displaced half the Syrian population, wrecked the Syrian economy, and even after winning the war has shown no concessions toward political reform or accountability for war crimes. He's also openly antagonized some of his Arab neighbors by flooding the region with illicit drugs and by building very close ties with Iran, which is an arch rival of some Arab states. And yet, despite all of that, he has managed to work his way back in to the region's diplomatic club. That is where we are today. What are the primary drivers of this change?
Well, first of all, I don't always agree with the Economist's editorial comments, because they tend to be, depending on who they're talking about, there are other ruthless dictators that the Economist never condemns in those words. I'm not defending Bashar Assad, believe me. But
Great.
so we need to keep that in mind.
Sure, it was one journalist's perspective.
But the way they have described Bashar Assad's regime, how it dealt with the protests, it basically started off as peaceful protests. They became a violent civil war because the way that his government decided to deal with the issue. Having said that, I think the imperative right now is that I think everybody realizes there's a major shifts going on internationally, globally, in terms of power relationships, in terms of emerging new centers of power. And the Arab world needs to, I think at least some people within that need to think that they need to completely reevaluate where they will stand in this new international order which is emerging. And I think that is the thinking behind many of the efforts which are being made in the region to kind of mend bridges regionally. Those bridges will, in my opinion, never be permanently mended. Because this, irrespective of who's in power, because there are geopolitical realities to the conflicts within the Arab world, which don't go away just because a regime changes or a regime gets friendly with another regime. But there's very clearly an understanding that a new world order is emerging, and they need to get their act together so that they can hopefully achieve what they want to achieve within that new order. And that includes most importantly, I think, the increasing influence of China in the region, which I think we plan to come to later on. So yeah. I'll defer to that right now.
Well, and before we do get to China and the détente it has taken credit for brokering between Iran and Saudi Arabia, let's just talk about something you said to me off camera, which is that a lot of what's happening right now is taking place kind of without worrying about what the Americans are thinking. And you were trying to capture this illustration of how power is shifting. And what did you mean by that?
What I meant was that there was a time when countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and the UAE and even Qatar, even Egypt for that matter, would hesitate to make major foreign policy shifts without consulting the United States at the very least. And I think that right now that is not the case, because they see the emergence of other powers which would balance US presence and influence in the region, whether rightly or wrongly. That's how it seems they're assessing things. And therefore, they feel they are freer to act on their own initiative rather than wait for a green light from the United States. I understand that the United States position is we gave the yellow light to allow Syria back into the Arab League, but I don't think a yellow light was needed. I think that there were other priorities which are very, very clearly these regimes have decided were more important than continuing the internal conflict between Syria and its neighboring Arab countries.
And let's talk about some of the drivers. There are Syrian asylum seekers who are looking, who are obviously outside of the country, and specifically nations like Jordan and Lebanon. This may be part of their calculus for this. Also, the argument that just normalizing relations can help bring an end to the violence and suffering. What is your reaction to, let's start with the refugee situation, and then we'll talk about how, that this may be a play toward ending violence. So I'll have you answer the first question first.
Well, the refugee, very clearly the Lebanese and the Jordanians in the Arab world have really carried the weight of the refugees created by the conflict, though actually the Turks have carried a higher weight, but they're not in the league. But the Jordanians and the Lebanese in particular, given their own economic crisis right now, have to deal with these huge number of Syrian refugees is an added burden. And if the Saudis and other countries which have the resources want to help Lebanon out, this is certainly part of the calculation. How do we lessen the pressure on Lebanon? And same with Jordan. Jordan, as we know, is not a rich country. And it too has been carrying a substantial burden of the refugees. Now, they've been getting money from some of the Gulf states to help support those refugees, but it is more than just getting money to support them. The question is, can we create a condition where these guys can go back? Mm-hmm. And whether that'll happen or not remains to be seen, because as the Economist points out, the Syrian government has given no indication that they will treat the people who they view as being traitors, who left the country or who fled or who joined the opposition during the civil war, in any way different from how they've been treating them so far. So
the idea that this may help bring an end to violence what's your reaction to that?
The ball is in the court of the Syrian government then. Maybe there's an agreement that, okay, we'll let you back into the league and we'll send our foreign ministers there and you can come visit us and take the refugees back and, don't continue with your current policy of, retaliation against those people. And maybe there's a deal to that effect, but we won't know that. It'll never be public, of course. Yeah.
Well, based on public statements by Syria's spokespeople, will say they're really ready to move on and are already courting investment, which is a big part of that. How likely do you see that suddenly the nation's open for business, they're going to be rebuilding their economy, restoring their place in the international order, whatever that is? Do you see that happening overnight? Is that what this is about, is just investment opportunities?
Well, it's not going to happen overnight, right? First of all, the Syrians were really isolated, both within the Arab world and generally, because think of it this way, the regime, and I think nobody will argue against this, the regime only survived because of intervention by Russia and Iran. Right? There was a point at which Bashar Assad was barely in control of even his capital. And at that point in the conflict, there was very little support in the Arab world for what he was doing. So getting out of that might not be as easy as some people might think it is. Yes, there will be investment opportunities. There'll be rebuilding. I think that the Syrians will be dependent for a long time on money and investment coming from the other Arab countries to help in the reconstruction effort. And of course, there are Syrians who don't like the fact that the Iranians are so deeply involved in Syria, just as there are Iraqis who are not happy with the level of Iranian involvement in Iraq. So there are a whole bunch of complex issues at work here. I think, though, that the Syrian government's calculus is that the sooner and to the extent that we can overcome our isolation is good. And they will at least pay lip service to whatever is required to overcome that isolation.
And there, you keep saying that there's complicated factors, and I feel like we simply can't get into all of the nuances of the relationships and the tensions. So let's move to China and so the détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran after what's 7 years roughly, with China assuming this role as peace broker. What does it say about American influence in the region versus China's influence in the region?
We shouldn't overplay the reduction of American influence in the region, because American influence in the region goes much beyond providing military equipment and political support to governments. There is a genuine influence of American soft power in the region, especially in the Gulf. So that's not going to go away in the short run. But the fact that the Chinese are moving in and they're doing what they have done in other parts of the world very effectively, and that is use their new economic muscle to build relationships, which then create ties which they can use to, press for political influence and so on, is interesting. So if I think we have a slide here on Chinese investments in West Asia, and this does include North Africa. If you could put that up. And this is actually not completely up to date, but it gives you an idea of the trend here. Excuse me. This is the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, that the Chinese have, which is the big international initiative. And Chinese investment associated with it in the countries of West Asia. This is not North Africa. This is just the Asian part of the Middle East or the Arab world. So you look at the numbers for Saudi Arabia, and this is before the recent visit of the Chinese president to Saudi Arabia, where they agreed to increase that investment by, I think, 40% or some figure like that. And the UAE and Iran and Egypt and Iraq, Algeria is North Africa, of course, and Iran is not in the Arab world. But those Arab countries that you see here, these are very significant investments. And then again, the investments between 2013 and 2018, as you can see, make up a huge chunk of the overall investment, which gives us some idea of the rate at which the Chinese are getting involved in the local economies, not only to help build the infrastructure for the Belt and Road Initiative, which passes through the region in so many different ways, both by sea and by land, but also as a way of helping develop other infrastructure projects, which at least in the Gulf and many other parts of the region used to be something the Americans did, right? We were the ones who got contracts to build infrastructure projects in different countries in the region. So that, I think, is a very significant factor. That, and the fact that even though the Turkish elections, as you know, were inconclusive, so we don't know what's going to happen, though the main, what's his name, the main opposition candidate who might win the runoff, Kılıçdaroğlu, actually said today that if he wins, he's going to send all the refugees back. Which is, it was a very blunt statement that he was going to send all the refugees back to Syria. Which is not the position of Erdogan, by the way. So if in the runoff, which is, I think, on the 26th, if I remember correctly, we see a change of president in Turkey that will further create problems for the region. So my point is that while we are looking at primarily at the League of Arab States and the internal conflicts and internal dynamics, they are not operating in a region which is, they're not isolated in the region. There are at least several countries, Turkey and Iran in particular, who are very heavily involved in their calculus in terms of what options are open to them and what alliances they can make and so on. And this coming back of Syria into the fold, by the way, has also been accompanied by an initiative by the UAE and Saudi Arabia to improve relations with Turkey, with whom they had also fallen out as a result of the Arab Spring, as it is called, uprisings.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask the team to take that slide down. And we actually do have a question. I was going to go to Israel, but let's go to Turkey. And I will encourage our audience, you can use the Q&A function to ask a question. Joe Sterling asks, how will the re-election of Erdogan or the re-election of the anti-Erdogan coalition affect Turkey's relationship with Syria? You just mentioned that, but I'll invite you to answer Joe's question.
I think that the AKP regime, which has been in power now for a long time in Syria, whether it was Erdogan or whether as prime minister or as president, or under the foreign minister Davutoglu, who is now in the opposition, Turkey really made a major shift in its policies, which it had been following since the establishment of the Turkish Republic way back in the 1920s, which was oriented toward the West, trying to become as integrated into Europe as possible. And that idea was kind of not given up, but put on the back burner while Turkey launched a huge initiative to get re-involved in what members of the Arab League we are talking about. They took a neutral position on the conflict in Iraq. For example, they didn't allow the United States and its allies to use its facilities for the invasion of Iraq in 2003. They supported all the Arab Spring uprisings, by the way, irrespective of where it was, whether it was in Libya or in Egypt or in Syria or wherever else. Excuse me. And not only that, they had launched a huge initiative to improve economic ties with many of these countries, including Syria, by the way, who before the uprising against Assad was one of the countries closest to Turkey's government, and they fell out over the uprising. So all this is now being questioned. There's already been some backtracking on this. The initial policy, which was very optimistic, which was called something like zero problems with neighbors policy, didn't quite work out the way that the Turkish government was hoping it would. But I think that if Erdogan loses the election, and given the fact that he has converted the Turkish system into a presidential system from what used to be a parliamentary system, giving a lot of power to the president, and if Kılıçdaroğlu follows the natural policies that his party, which is an old party, the CHP, will follow, then there is going to be a major shift in many of the things that Turkey has been doing in the region, which includes, like, for example, expelling the close to 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey back into Syria, or the close ties that Turkey had developed with Qatar, which, by the way, allowed Qatar to survive the boycott, which the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and Egypt had put in place against them. So those that will have big implications for the region's own regional dynamics of Turkey. And in an early interview, Kılıçdaroğlu also said that he will once more turn, some words to that effect, Turkey back towards the West. So if Turkey is going to go back to its old policy of minimal involvement in the region, that is going to, again, upset the cart, as it were, of the dynamics and balance of power in the region.
Sure. Well, we did title this this webinar "Shifting Alliances," so we could do a virtual forum on every single one of those relationships. We do have some questions going in, but I want to just touch back on the summit itself, which is getting underway. A lot happens behind the scenes. There's actually a lot of progress that can happen that never gets covered or gets a headline. What do you anticipate happening that may not get the headlines that could be good news?
Can I give a little background as to why I'm skeptical?
Of course.
Okay.
Of course.
The problem with the Arab League is both structural and also problems in terms of what the member states want out of it. Right? when the Arab League was initially formed, and that is still the case today, different countries have very different ideas about what this organization should be doing. Right? There were people on one side who looked upon it essentially as like a club where you got together and discussed common issues and maybe came up with some strategy to deal with some of those issues purely on a voluntary basis, right? And then there were others who really looked upon the Arab League as the first step towards forming some kind of a federation of Arab states, right? And as you can imagine, this means that depending on what your outlook is, you have very different expectations from such an organization and very different ideas of what that organization should be able to do and should not be able to do. So philosophically, this has always been a problem in the League. The structural problem is there is rules of procedure, which are based, by the way, on the rules of procedure of the League of Nations. And we all know where the League of Nations ended up and why it did. This insistence on unanimous decisions and resolutions only being binding on countries which vote for them, which is kind of, in my view, a ridiculous idea. But nevertheless, means that the organization has the fact that the League has survived as an organization, even as a dysfunctional organization, is in itself a miracle in my view. But in terms of things coming out of it, I don't know. I think that the one thing which might come out of this, which would be something to look for, is will the Arab world come together in a unified policy on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, given the nature of the current Israeli government? And the ideas which many of the coalition partners in the current Israeli government have, which, if were carried out, would cause huge problems for the Arab world, especially the neighboring countries.
Sure.
And what impact that has on the Abraham Accords idea, and so on. So something might come out of that in that area. Definitely bringing back Syria into the fold and maybe coming up with some kind of a solution to the ongoing confrontation in Libya and now in Sudan, and in Yemen, which is still kind of up in the air. Those are issues they should be discussing, how seriously they'll be discussed, and whether everybody will agree that it is in everybody's interest to end or minimize these conflicts remains to be seen. So the surprise part is that we don't know what's going to come out of it.
Right.
Put it that way.
And as you said, there is nothing is binding, that when there's a vote, it only applies to those who voted yes. And we should point out that only 13 of the 22 member nations actually showed up to the Syria vote. So it's just about half. So it's certainly not a unanimous.
And by the way, when they voted to expel Syria, many of the members didn't show up at that point too.
So, well, we have that problem in the US too, just not showing up for votes. So let's just stay on. First of all, just a quick note, the Turkey runoff is May 28th. So we'll be watching that for sure. I actually want to pick up on what you were saying about there may be something that comes out vis-a-vis the Palestinians. In January, shortly before the national elections in Israel, the Arab League did call as a bloc for Israeli Arabs to vote so that they can stop the establishment of a right-wing government that will, quote, promote racist laws and ethnic cleansing. That is that's something coming out of the Arab League as an organization. So what would be potentially the way to build on that this weekend, if that's what they in fact choose to talk about?
They might draw some lines, whether they can hold those lines or not it remains to be seen, about what would be acceptable as decisions being made by the current Israeli government. Because don't forget that, if I remember correctly, there are two parties in the current government who, as their part of their election manifesto, were calling for the expulsion of Palestinians from the West Bank in very large numbers, and even withdrawing citizenship for Palestinian Israelis who had Israeli citizenship, or putting those citizenships under to keep those citizenships only if they gave an oath of loyalty to the state of Israel. And those are ideas which, if they tried to put into force, would have some really serious repercussions for the region and for the whatever progress has been made in normalizing relations between Israel and at least some of the other countries. And that would be of concern because there are regimes who have stuck their necks out, like places like the UAE and Bahrain and Egypt and so on pushing this idea of the possibility of a long-term solution to the Palestinian problem based on the Abraham Accord idea, though how that fits in, I don't know. But the whole idea of normalization would become a big political liability for many regimes if these policies were actually implemented.
We have a question from our audience, and just a reminder, you can use the Q&A function to ask your question of Dr. Naim. Annie Agnihotri asks, what are your thoughts about a new quadrilateral forum comprising India, Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States?
Well, this is just one of those things that is up there, and the UAE, of course, is very keen on this. And hence there, as you know, I should actually also have mentioned that another big player in the region, always been, but has become more important now, at least in the Gulf, has been India. Because India is again one of those emerging centers of power which weren't there even 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And their presence and their rivalry with China and their presence in the region adds more spice to the pot, if you will. Yeah, that is another idea which is being considered, but I don't think that many of the other countries in the region place a very high priority on it, given the domestic situation in India itself with regard to what is viewed as mistreatment of religious minorities and so on. The largest one happening to be Muslims, of course, but there are other religious minorities too who claim that they're facing discrimination. So I don't know how far that will go, but there are definitely interests which align, especially between India and the Gulf countries, not only in terms of the very large number of people from India who work in those countries and the money that they send back to India, but also trade links and project links that have been developed between the Gulf countries and India in particular.
Let's introduce a character we haven't yet spent a lot of time on, which is Iran, which despite not being a member of the Arab League, has enormous influence over the Arab League. What may come out? What is shifting? If we're talking about shifting alliances in a significant way, we can go back to Iran and Saudi Arabia. What impact does that have on the region as a whole?
If the Saudis and the Iranians move to a situation where they have, if not cordial relations, at least normal relations when they're speaking to each other, and there is no immediate threat of use of force of one against the other, I think that has a big impact on the dynamics of the region. The Chinese, for example, believe that their BRI project cannot go ahead without the Saudis and the Iranians at least talking to each other. The problem with the Iranians that is seen in the region is that this goes back to the Iranian Revolution. It really goes back to that time when you had, because remember the relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran and all these Gulf sheikdoms in Iran was very cordial before the Shah was overthrown in 1979. And what happened in Iran was viewed as an existential threat by both the monarchies in the Gulf and by the secular national governments in the Arab world, because Iran was basically overthrowing the Iran Revolution overthrew a model where you had a monarchy and you had essentially a secular political system. And what the Iranian regime did, or the Iran Revolution ended up doing, was getting rid of both of those things. Hence the decision when Iraq decided to invade Iran in 1980 of the Gulf countries to basically back Iraq, even though the Iraqis and Saddam Hussein's government didn't have great relations with the Gulf states. So that whole idea of being able to challenge the legitimacy, especially of the Gulf monarchies, is still there, right? Helped by the fact that a lot of people might not be aware that a huge part of the population of Eastern Saudi Arabia, where the oil is actually Shia Arabs, right? Which gives the Iranians, or the Iranians think it gives them some kind of in, as you will, into the populations of that region and into Iraq, of course, which thanks to the policies of the United States was handed over to Iran on a platter for a long time. And they still pretty much are the dominant power there, even though there's a lot of now resistance to the Iranian presence there by Iraqis themselves. So the a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, will never be complete because there's a fundamental ideological difference between what these two kinds of regimes stand for. But at least if there's not this constant threat of, oh, they're going to go to war, or they're going to, start sabotaging each other's oil facilities, that kind of stuff would have an impact. But I think the area where Iran Saudi rapprochement might have the best positive impact is to bring to an end this horrendous war which is going on in Yemen, where the two countries have taken opposite sides. I think that is helped by the fact that the Saudi-UAE alliance on one side of this has also broken apart, because now the Saudis and the UAE don't see eye to eye on what they want in Yemen. So I think that that conflict was definitely exacerbated by the Saudi-Iranian rivalry and the way they viewed each other.
Well, that is actually a good way to open up. You mentioned Sudan and now Yemen, the broader picture of how the region as a whole is in trouble, as I think the term you used was on fire. And how that this sort of attitude toward reconciliation may be a response to spiraling conflicts, that this can actually reframe and sort of force collaboration. What do you see? Do you see that that's what's happening? That there's a new motivation to come back to the table to talk?
I would definitely not discount that completely. If you think about it for a minute, forget about what's going on in the Arab League countries themselves, like Sudan and Yemen and so on. Look at the region in the immediate neighborhood to them. All of sub-Saharan Africa and all those countries which have borders with Arab League countries, they all have insurgencies going on, which are bitter insurgencies. There's an ongoing conflict in Ethiopia, which seems to have cooled down for a while, for a few years, hopefully permanently, but we don't know what's going to happen with that. We know what's going on in South Sudan and now, of course, in Sudan, which seems to get worse day by day. So all around them, right, at least to the south of them, right, there is this big arc which is literally on fire. I mean, there's no other way to deal with it. And not only is it on fire, the traditional methods of controlling those areas are not working. So the old standard that, oh, we'll get French troops to come in and help these governments stay in power, that doesn't work. And so what do we have? We have Russian mercenaries there on the side of the governments, several of those governments fighting against the rebels instead of the French, which was the normal scenario there. So again, we are talking about forces from outside the region who are heavily involved in the surrounding area. And in the case of Syria, of course, within the Arab League countries, where Iran and Turkey and the Russians are very heavily involved there. So yes, there is, if I was sitting around there and looking as an Arab nationalist, looking at the world around them, that would be certainly something to be alarmed about. And the Arab countries of North Africa are not immune from being dragged into these conflicts, especially those in Niger and Mali, and even Chad to some extent.
We have a question from the audience. Mike D asks, this is a soccer-related question. How significant is state ownership of European football clubs by Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, to the power balance in the Middle East?
Look, these are prestige games, right? The soccer, as you know, is a very popular sport in that part of the world. The idea of having somebody like Messi or Ronaldo coming in.
Ronaldo's playing for Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
From Manchester United.
That's right. So it's that is definitely part of it. But don't forget that European and British soccer clubs are up for sale right now. they're American actors from Hollywood who are buying those those teams. So
Ryan Reynolds.
and for many of these countries, they might actually look upon it as an investment for their sovereign funds. Why not? If you have all that money lying around and you can turn these into profitable franchises.
Sure. But Mike's question is actually on how, this is great, I had thought about it that way, how the ownerships of these clubs is how significant it is to the power balance back at home.
Oh, back at home in the countries where these teams are from?
In the Middle East, in the region.
Or in the region itself. I don't know. I actually don't follow soccer so much.
Okay.
So confession. But these are, again, I view them as prestige projects, really.
Okay.
I own such and such great soccer team from somewhere in Europe, or my country does, or my sovereign fund does, or whatever the case might be. I don't think they have, at least as of now, don't have political implications.
Well, we'll find out. That's actually really interesting thought, that they're proxy battles on the pitch.
Qatar is very successful hosting of the World Cup, definitely enhances prestige, right? And it was successful in the sense that people were expecting it to be a total disaster. It was not, in fact, far from it. And I think that that might give ideas to other people in the region that this is one way of establishing a more positive image for yourself. I don't know.
Well, if we have any more questions from the audience, let me just check. You all can use the Q&A function if you have questions for Dr. Naim. But if not, I am going to have the last question, which is, what we focused on today are the things we're reading about in the paper, the big issues. What isn't getting discussed that you think does need to be discussed? Is it climate change? Is it the strength of the dollar, crypto? What is it? I mentioned the drug trade at the top. What isn't making headlines that you think should be?
I think that what is not making headlines and should be discussed is how even 10 years after the initial uprisings in the region, right, no progress has been made towards addressing the underlying reasons for those uprisings to begin with, right? In terms of youth unemployment, in terms of even other things like lack of opportunity, of corruption, of concentration of wealth, those kind of issues, which in my view were and really the disenfranchisement of large parts of the population and how those countries are run. Except for a few cases where some of the smarter rulers made some adjustments, like in Morocco, for example, nobody else has really, it's like taken this time to say, okay, this almost led to a total collapse in the region for these regimes. What can we do to prevent that from happening again? Besides, we'll have more stringent security measures or use force more viciously than we have in the past. I don't see any serious efforts, at least at the league level, to come up with ideas on how do we reduce the tensions which led to the initial uprisings of 2011, 2012. I think that is, climate change actually is being discussed at a very low level right now, but much more than it was being discussed earlier, because I think a lot of people in the region now realize that this is one part of the world which is probably going to be most seriously affected by climate change. And so there's some discussion of that. But again, the broad underlying issues, it's just like, it's like, let's keep the pressure on so the steam stays in the pot instead of, dealing with the underlying problems. And I think that's the real challenge of the region, dealing with the underlying problems.
Well, going back to the economist quote that you reacted to about that the Arab League tends to be a club of ruthless dictators, and you reacted strongly to that. But it sounds like
that part of the description is accurate, right? My issue really is that these people are dictators because they don't represent the will of their people. That's why no sane person wants to be a dictator if they have popular support, right? So the fact that they don't have popular support, I think in my mind is the strongest indicator that they don't represent the will of their people, whether it comes to their economic policies or their cultural policies or their social policies or whatever policies they have. And this is just the old game of the elites deciding that, oh, we're going to drag you where we want to drag you, whether you like it or not, because we know what's good for you. And all these people, by the way, when I believe that all these people, even though some of them are really abhorrent characters, are people who in their own way are sincere in their belief that what they're doing is good for their people, which is what makes it so
You mean the attendees at the summit this year?
that it is in the greater interests of Syria as a country for us to have crushed this uprising the way we have. I'm sure there are lots of people in the Syrian government who actually believe that. Or what the Egyptian military did when they overthrew the only elected president the country had. Whether he was a good president or not is not the issue. So all these people, you know, they think they're doing what is good for their own country. Right?
Well, as anybody who's been a manager knows, you just don't actually really know until you ask people what they think and what they want. That's something.
Well, you might not like the answer, Rickey.
Right.
That's the whole problem, right?
Yeah. Well, that is the time we have for today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you to Dr. Rashid Naim of Georgia State University. Oh, thank you to our audience. Oh, I think I'm gonna lose you all. Sorry. Am I on camera still? Oh,
Yeah, you are.
the third wall has been broken. I want to thank our audience for joining us here at the World Affairs Council of Atlanta. We do have an email newsletter that features our upcoming events. Many of them are in person, some of them are virtual, but you can sign up for that newsletter at our website, wacatlanta.org. And we look forward to seeing many of you at a future event, including you, Dr. Naim. We hope to see you at a future World Affairs Council of Atlanta event.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
It was fun. Okay.
Yes. Okay, good. I'm so glad. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.